All right, welcome everyone. This is our December Fan History Zoom. Today, our topic is Amateur Press Associations, or APAs. And so we have a very experienced panel of APA contributors, and I'm going to start us off by asking them to introduce themselves and tell us how they got into fandom. Go. Tom, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, it's easy for anyone to start. I got into fandom because my parents went to a picnic with a woman who later went on to become a writer named Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough. And we were, we ate and all of that sort of thing. And then as we were driving home, she and I talked about the Black Plague for hours, which made everyone else look at us funny. My parents had a few fanzines lying around, a couple of issues of the Rotomagnetic Digest, and a lot of science fiction books. But Quinn turned into the fourth unindicted co-chair for BACON in 1968, and she got me to volunteer for it and help out. And that was basically how I started working with organized fandom, or not so organized fandom if you go to many Worldcons. From there, I got involved with going to more conventions, went down to Westercon the following year in '69, and met a bunch of people in LA and got involved with APA-L, which was my first APA, which is a weekly APA. We'll get into all of that later on. Next. Christina.
Amy. Or Christina. Somebody.
Christina, why don't you go?
Okay, well, I got into fandom when I was at university. So I was in my final year at university and had just been away in France for a year, and so needed some new friends because most of the people I knew had graduated. And I went along to the SF group, which I'd been thinking about doing for several years, but hadn't got around to. And they were a nice bunch of people, mostly into D&D and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But one thing they did have was a big box of fanzines that Peter Weston had given them. So they, for some reason, I think it's because they had a fanzine of their own and I'd written a couple of things for that. They thought I'd be interested in fanzines. So they kept giving me the fanzines, and then eventually I kind of had to read them so I could give them back. And eventually I got hooked on the whole idea of fandoms. So I found out about conventions, and then the next year I moved up to Glasgow and I joined the SF group there, Friends of Kilgore Trout. I went to conventions. I met up with Lillian Edwards, who became my co-editor on a fanzine, and spent most of the early 80s onwards doing fanzines and going to conventions and occasionally involved with running conventions and standing for TAFF and things like that. So just threw myself into the whole fan life, really.
Wow. Well, I was in college in Moscow, Idaho, and a bunch of my friends were putting on a convention and I got roped into it, and that was kind of it. Once I'd done one, I couldn't stop. It's a bit like potato chips. And then I went to Norwestcon. I think that would have been 1980. And Dennis, I either asked or Dennis invited me to join Cascades Rocky Amateur Press Association, which was CRAPA. And that was my first APA. And the first APAzine was literally hand typed on a Smith Corona machine, and I Xeroxed it, and then I hand painted the ladybugs red. It was like, I don't do that anymore. And that's kind of how I got into fandom.
Well, I got into fandom about 61 years ago. It was December. I was a freshman at Columbia, and one day I was talking to somebody at the reception desk in my dormitory about science fiction and Stranger in a Strange Land. I heard a voice behind me saying, "Stranger in a Strange Land is crap." turned out it was a fellow called Carl Frederick, and he told me about the City College Science Fiction Club, which met about a mile away, and I started going to the meetings. Now, I was prepared for fandom because I'd read about its existence, probably in some book by Sprague de Camp or somebody like that. And I'd even heard a couple of speeches from a Worldcon on WBAI in New York, though I didn't understand any of the in references and so forth.
Mm.
So I went to that first meeting there. Among the people I met there was John Boardman. Well, there was an introduction to fanzines if you've ever heard of one. I liked the idea very much, wanted to do one of my own. It was very helpful in helping me get them printed. I joined my first APA, the Nefer Amateur Press Alliance, or NEAPA, which was run by the National Fantasy Fan Federation, and just kept going on from there. I joined the FAPA, the Fantasy Amateur Press Association, back in 1979, I guess, and have been producing a zine for them ever since. I intend to continue doing so until mortality stops me.
So Tom and Fred have talked about their first APAs. Amy and Christina, why don't you talk a little bit about how did you get introduced to APAs? What was the first one you saw? And then how did you get involved?
Well, like I said, I met a whole bunch of people at Norwestcon who were in CRAPA, the Cascades Rockies Amateur Press Association. And I joined it because I was living in a small town and I needed more friends. I needed to get out in some way. And APA was a good way to extend my acquaintance outside the small town. And I was actually a fannish hoax. I showed up at, I think, the next year's Norwestcon and introduced myself to Rich McAllister and said, "Hi, I'm Amy Thomson. We're in CRAPA together." And he was like, "Oh my God, you're real. I thought Dennis made you up."
There was, in fact, an APA for hoaxes at one point that I was one of the co-founders of.
Oh, Tom, don't stop now.
Yes.
No, it was called APA H. It was put together by Freff. Now there's a name many of you probably don't remember. Connor Freff Cochran now.
Oh, yes.
James Langdell and me, who were all accused of being the same person in APA L. And so we said, well, why don't we make an APA for hoaxes? So we did.
Oh, I wasn't invited. Oh, well.
We didn't know you were a hoax.
So who are the APAs? Can you talk a little bit about the differences in the way APAs felt versus fanzines?
I think we got off Christina.
Yeah, I haven't done my
I'm
first
sorry. Go ahead,
APA
Christina. Go
experience.
ahead. Go.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think when I got into fandom in Britain, it was very different from you in that there wasn't really any APAs around to join, because I think the APA that had been around OMPA had already ceased to be viable, existent at that point. So I didn't join an APA till 1982 when Linda Pickersgill Korecki now introduced TWP, the women's periodical. So basically this came out of a convention in 1982 where women all got together and talking about their lack of visibility in fandom and wanting to have some forum where women could actually talk to each other and work on their writing and get some confidence up. So that was how TWP, the women's periodical, was born. Why I joined it was because everybody else was joining it. So even though I had a lot of skepticism about APAs at that point, because the received wisdom was that APAs were a waste of time, but they were a way of sucking FANAC into a corner where nobody ever would see it again. But there was a lot of enthusiasm for the whole idea of an APA for women, so I wanted to be part of it. And that was my first APA experience.
Did you feel that you could that participants could say things in the women's periodical that they couldn't say elsewhere?
Yeah, I think very much so. I think that was part of what the attraction was.
Do you know if TWP was influenced by a woman's APA?
I imagine so. I mean, Linda, coming from America, would have, I think she was aware of those APAs. So, I mean, I don't know for sure, but
yeah,
I definitely feel she was certainly well versed in APAs and knew what she was talking about when it came to actually trying to create an APA community, which there was no tradition for in the UK.
right.
So do you feel that it lived up to expectations?
What, TWP? Yeah. Well, actually, what I was going to say is my expectations weren't very high, because I didn't actually believe that I wanted to be in an APA. I wanted to be in that APA because it was happening and everybody was joining, but I didn't really want to be in an APA. I really wanted to do fanzines. I thought having to write something every couple of months for this, actually it's every 6 weeks when it started, for this new venture was going to get in the way of doing other things, or that I wouldn't have time. And then it turned out I had, but as soon as we got going, it turned into something quite fantastic that had an amazing amount of energy, had very, very successful, quickly got, within a year, we'd got to the point where we decided how many our maximum number of members was, which was 36, and we'd got to that by the start of the second year of the APA. So it was phenomenal and quite transformative, I think, for the women who were in it, and I guess made some changes to British fandom as well. And it also kicked off a whole wave of APAs in the UK. So everybody else wanted to join in the whole APA boom after that.
So you said that, you felt APAs were a place where fandom went into a little corner and no one ever saw your FANAC again. Does everyone feel like that? I mean, you all are participants in APAs.
Well,
I have to say, I don't feel like that now. That was just the perceived wisdom at the time in Britain by people who'd seen OMPA dying and didn't see any reason for there to be APAs anymore.
Well, we're going back to that question after a while. Amy, you were going to jump in there?
well, I gotta say, it really did APAs kind of did suck me in, and I think I pubbed my ish once, because APAs were just, they were small, they were convenient, they were easy. I didn't have to have a huge mailing list of people and worry about who I was leaving out. I'd send it off and it would go out to the APA membership, and that was enough for me.
I believe that APAs serve the same function as intentional communities. That an APA, where something like Facebook is just so huge, you can't really deal with everybody. There are small intentional communities online. Howard Rheingold's Brainstorms is an example that I'm part of. It's the equivalent of an APA, where there are a limited number of people and you can talk with them about a lot of things. They're not people I'd know otherwise in general, but they're a very useful way for people to have sincere interactions in a way that Facebook doesn't necessarily allow. When you're dealing with sending things to 1,000 people, it's really different than when you're dealing with people sending things to 20. You can actually see that somebody isn't responding and get back to them and say, hey, did you notice this? Or you can't avoid them anywhere near as easily.
So say some more about the difference between genzines, between fanzines and apazines, right? Because I think, Amy, you did mostly apazines. Christina, you never stopped pubbing your ish, your non-APA fanzines. Fred, I'm not familiar with a lot of zines that you've published except the ones that are apazines. So what do you guys think about the difference between?
Well, it's not really that much of a hard and fast line. For example, my own zine, Lafjarnost, which I've been producing, I should say, for 40 odd years, some of them very odd. It's nominally a FAPA zine that is distributed through the Fantasy Amateur Press Association, which accounts for about 15 or 20 copies. And the other 100 or so are distributed more generally to friends of mine. So it's perhaps more what some people would call a personal zine than an apazine. On the other hand, since a good part of each issue consists of letters of comment from various readers, it's not necessarily all that personal. So in the past, I've been involved with more old-fashioned APAs. The thing about the FAPA now was originally started with the idea that it would serve as an economical way of people distributing their fanzines to their readers. And the idea of mailing comments and all the like were not originally intended, but they just sort of grew up around it. The FAPA today, what there is of it, is almost back to that original stage, and that I would say maybe half the members do mailing comments. The others are just putting out their own idiosyncratic things without particularly worrying about whether anybody else in the group is interested in the content. To be perfectly honest, I stay in the FAPA more out of tradition than anything else, and my intention is to stay with it as long as both it and I exist. There are one or two members who've been around even longer than I have who have an emotional attachment to it, and I don't want to be the one who pulls that out from under anybody.
No.
So Fred, do you read the rest of the FAPA zines?
Yeah, though not necessarily when they come in. There's some of them I'm not interested in. A couple of the people who are producing them are really into Star Trek, which I have no interest whatever in. So I will skim through the mailings and read the stuff that interests me, and pretty much ignore the rest of it. If I did have a comment to make on one of the things, I would probably send that as a note to the zine producer rather than making a comment on it in my own zine. Though when I was doing mailing comments, I tend to try to do them in such a way that each one was a sort of an independent freestanding mini essay that could be understood by somebody who had never seen the thing I was commenting on.
Right.
That seems very different from either TWP or Zappa, another APA I'm in at the moment, because I feel they're far more about being part of the community, a bit more like Tom was saying, and about interacting with other people in some form or other. And there's certainly a lot of heart searching in APA, which is quite a large APA at the moment and can run to 500, 600 pages for mailing. Amongst people wanting to read it all, wanting to be able to comment to everybody, but feeling guilty when they can't. But it's definitely part of the sort of tradition of the APA is that you are talking to the other people in the APA as well as writing your own content, and maybe quite a lot of your content will be sparked off by what other people are talking about. So it is quite different from Genzine, which again is part of a conversation of a community, but with a slightly different community.
I am real, I like mailing comments. I find them really what makes an APA work for me. I spend a lot of time writing mailing comments. I will start 2 weeks before the deadline, and do a quick what I've been up to, and then the rest of it is all mailing comments with a little, sort of epilogue when it's all done. And yes, for me, it's APAs are a conversation. I know that's not how they started. Originally, my understanding is that the Amateur Press Association was literally a bunch of letterpress people who would collate their zine, their publications together and send them out to be admired by all the other letterpress people.
Yeah. At one of the Smithsonian museums in Washington, there was an exhibit. I don't know if it was temporary or permanent one about the small printing presses that were available to essentially teenagers in the post-Civil War period. And it was from that the whole amateur magazine thing got going. So the roots of this of our particular obsession go back further than most of us think.
And to some extent, what brought it into the science fiction field was H.P. Lovecraft and members of his circle being active in the National Amateur Press Association and similar groups.
Right.
And
Now,
sort of introduced the science fiction people to the idea.
Getting back to the mailing comments thing, a friend of mine in Alabama is active in the Southern Fandom Press Alliance, or SEPA, and so is Rich Lynch, for example. And they send me copies of their SEPA zines, which are very largely mailing comments. And one gets the impression that, at least I get the impression, that SEPA is these days more of the what we think of as a traditional APA than pretty much anything else that's going.
Yeah.
So are you monogamous, or do you do multiple APAs at once? Tell us about your different APAs.
Well, I was in CRAPA for a very long time. I also contributed to the Worldcon Order of FANED's Worldcon APA a few times, and I was in AWA. I was in Intercourse. I founded, because the mailing list for AWA was, the mailing list for AWA was 50 people long, and it was like, you could have a whole nother APA.
Waiting list, rather.
Yeah, waiting list, yes. And I said, well, why not? And there was also someone in that APA who had hurt me very badly, and I didn't want to be in the same APA as that person. And so I went off and started my own APA, and one of the rules was if you were in one, you couldn't be in the other, which very neatly took care of the whole issue with this person I didn't care for very much. And that was great, but happily it became it wasn't, even if there was an element to spite in its founding, happily it became this whole other thing. I decided that my focus was going to be international, and I had women from Israel and South Africa, Europe, Australia, all over, the multiple language speakers. It was really kind of fun. And what was interesting is things kind of went in waves. There was a wave of women who joined the APA and divorced their husbands, including and right now I'm seeing in TWP there's a wave of women who are coping with the problem of older relatives, mothers and fathers who are old and require care, and for some it's a big problem, and for some, they've resolved it fairly gracefully. I'm past that, but it's interesting to see how that kind of thing happens, that APAs form standing waves of stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
culturally, there have been standing waves too. I think that one of the things that led to the large boom in APAs in the early 70s was the rise of photo reproduction technology. Before that, we had to type our APAs on stencils, mostly, for Ditto or Mimeo, depending on what we had. And the central mailer would often print them. With the rise of cheap offset printing, it became much easier to found APAs, less intercourse, APA H, APA Pi. A bunch of APAs are started right around the same time. Intercourse was put together by Deb Notkin and me, or mostly Deb, around basically getting people to talk about relationships and things of that sort. Yes, it was named that because of the old joke about finding a 4-letter word ending in K that means intercourse, which is, of course, talk.
Yeah, I did some while I've been in TWP all the time since it was founded in 1982, I have been in other APAs, and one of them was Intercourse. I was there for a while in the early 2000s, I think. And yeah, I was just trying to say, I sure had something else I was going to say. But anyway, yes, I do find that I'm not totally monogamous with APAs, because although I've stayed with TWP throughout, I've looking back at when I've joined other APAs and realized I obviously had something that made me want to be part of a different APA. So I did Intercourse, and then for a while I did eAPA. So that was electronic APA before other APAs went electronic. And I kind of like the idea of doing my APA electronically, because it cut out a lot of the work involved with reproducing it and so forth. But I got a bit bored with the APA itself. And then eventually in 2016, I joined ANZAPA because, well, partly because Claire Briley and Mark Plummer and Spike all were members and were talking about how wonderful it was. And somehow, and partly because I'm really interested in Australia and Australian fandom, because I'd visited there before. So yeah, I have not been monogamous in my APA life. But I now know remember what I was going to say to Tom, which was that you were talking about having a sort of wave of APAs in the 70s because of the rise of cheap reproductive technology. And so that suggests to me that maybe in Britain we're about 10 years later in getting that technology, because we had a big boom of APAs in the 80s. So don't know if we were really 10 years behind you, but it took that amount of time to get going.
Do you find that there's an age cohort in an APA that everyone is around, I don't know, within 15 years of the same age? Because that would explain your standing waves. Right? Everyone's coping with the same thing at the same time.
Definitely true in TWP. We came through sort of starting in the 80s talking about babies and menstruation and so forth, and eventually now, as Amy says, we were all getting older. And although there have been newer members come in from time to time, the age cohort is still trending upwards. And I think similar in ANZAPA.
Certainly wasn't true in APA-L, at least, where the age range, it tended to be the younger people, but a bunch of the older people were, stayed on for a very long time. A weekly APA is a different beast than a quarterly APA.
Yeah. Talk more about that. How is it different? How does it feel different?
Because it's mostly about mailing comments. There's not a whole lot of other stuff in there. There's less artwork because people don't go out and get filler artwork to make to break the pages up. There's much more of a feeling of you don't want to miss anything. You don't want to have it. If you miss a week, you get kind of bummed because you missed the chance to make comments on stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's a bit more like something like Facebook where you just make comments more or less straight away.
Yeah.
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 APAs were kind of like the internet before the internet.
It was the
Very
slow
good.
internet.
Yes.
Mm.
I
Um,
think
Go ahead.
different.
I think that to a large extent, at least for me, what one would get from an APA with frequent mailing comments and the like, well, I get that now from one or two of the online discussion groups that I belong to. So obviously, if you have a topic that comes up and a bunch of people have got stuff to say about it, information gets exchanged a lot faster in one of those things than in a quarterly APA.
Yeah.
I've been involved not only in APAs, but also I've tended to back in the day associate myself with some genzine that a friend has put out, and that I can be part of that community. So for example, I was a columnist for Nyekis for many years at Meshki's zine, and some zines that other people at Columbia put out and so forth. I think my focus has been more the personal essay than anything else. And my zine fulfills my need to do that. And for discussion of topics of immediate interest, then the fiction mags or third level, similar discussion groups, that suits that need very well. I guess as with many other things, when it comes to communication, I'm a big believer in appropriate technology.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different APAs. Can you all talk about how you perceive the personalities of the APAs? What makes them different? Why would you join one instead of another? And then
Well,
I'm going to ask you to tell about all the ones you've been in.
hmm.
So
Well, some of it is focus. I mean, my husband is the editor now for Raubrazel, which is the funny animal APA. And God, they mail out 2 fascicles. I mean, they're just the amount of paper that washes through the house around the time of collation is awe-inspiring. But most of mine have been very personal APAs. Crappa was just sort of the Bay Area, Seattle fan axis communicating with each other. AWA was the same thing. It was about feminists in fandom talking to each other and talking about their issues and their lives. Intercourse, much the same. TWP again. BIWA again was the focus was on people and their lives and what they were going through.
The reason to join any APA is the people.
Yeah.
The reason I got into APAs was the people I'd met at Lostas, and in particular, Bruce Pells, who was an omni-APA. He tried to be a member of every APA there was at the time in the 60s.
OE of most of them.
Yeah. And I don't know how he found the energy, but back then we wrote a lot more letters too. At least I did. Karen has been going through a bunch of my old stuff and finding literally boxes of letters to and from people. And I didn't type, so I hand wrote. Most of them were handwritten too. In fact, several of my early apazines were handwritten because I didn't type.
Right.
Which the photocopying technology made much easier.
Tom, so do tell us about the cult.
Well, the cult. It's Fred was also a member. So
yes,
Fred can talk about it just as much as I can. He was in it before I was, in fact, if I recall.
Well, I mentioned John Boardman, who was in many ways my Spanish mentor when I was getting into this whole business. And he was a member of the cult. And from what I saw and heard about it sounded interesting. So I got on the wait list and took my turn at publishing the Fantasy Rotator with John's printing help. Now, the cult operated a bit differently from most other things. Its purpose was nominally to publish a tri-weekly, that is every 3 weeks, thing called the Fantasy Rotator, which the 13 members of the cult published in turn.
Mm.
Each issue contained primarily correspondence from the members, because you were supposed to contribute to at least every other issue to keep your place in there. The cult had a reputation, sometimes a nickname of the nastiest bastards in fandom, which was a bit of an exaggeration. There was an endless play of nasty ones outside of the cult, but largely because the discussion was pretty freewheeling. If there was any kind of a major controversy going on in fandom, it would be argued about in the cult. And there was a sufficiently wide range of personalities in there that sometimes the discussions got a little ferocious.
It wouldn't surprise me at all if the 13 nastiest bastards thing was a comment from Walter Green, because he came under a lot of fire.
Oh, yeah.
In the,
There was discussion of all of that business in the cult
yes.
when I was a member, and I made an announcement which got nicknamed the Lerner Pact, stating that I was not going to write or publish anything connected with that whole business, and encouraged other people to do so.
So you mean the Boondoggle, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, when in the 80s, whenever we almost talked about the Boondoggle, we would get either a note from Marianne or a call or something not to. So that prohibition went on for quite a while, as far as I know, in many places.
Well, I still
Wasn't
abide
anywhere
by
near
it,
as-
so I'm not going to say anything more about it here.
No, you don't have to.
No.
It
Tom?
wasn't near as bad as the whole controversy around Coventry. You know,
That was before my
Boondoggle was talked about, at least in passing. Coventry basically got lost. But that's a whole other discussion.
I'm just so disappointed. I always thought that the 13 nastiest bastards in fandom must have really just choice and juicy snark involved. But here you say
Not
they were
so
fans.
much. Not so much.
We are starting to put up some fantasy rotators, by the way.
George Sithers was member 13 for a very, very long time. And there are people who thought that George was a nasty bastard, but I know very few people who really did.
So was it invitation only as an APA? And were there only 13 of you?
There was
It
only
13 members, 5 active waitlisters who got all publications, and except for things that had photographs and other things where they could get an abridged version, and then an inactive waitlist. It was not invitational in that anyone could put themselves on the waitlist. It just took a long time to get in.
one of the things that the cult inspired was another APA called TAPS, the Tarian Amateur Press Society, which I believe Arnie Katz and Len Bales got started. And the idea of that was to provide something cult-like for people who of a somewhat younger fannish generation, and people who did not want to wait around on the cult waiting list forever. I was one of the original members of that, as I recall.
Yes. And Len is, in fact, part of the conversation in the chat.
So there are a couple of questions that you guys might want to address. One is, Tom, could you do about a 2-minute description of Coventry? And then the next one from Randy Smith is, how did the cult die?
Is it dead?
Well, there you go.
I don't know. I
don't know if
heard
it's
at
dead or
one
not. I know
point that
it was
in-
still going well through well into its second cycle of 1313s.
I had heard that it had degenerated into an online discussion forum or something like that, but I haven't had any contact with it for several decades now, so I couldn't tell you. I have no idea who was in it or who was in it or whatever.
Coventry was a thing that happened in Los Angeles fandom and through its fanzines, where a group of people were basically doing live action role playing before the SCA got started. And some people got very upset about it, taking over people's lives and people killing other people's characters without their permission. There was a fair amount of drugs involved. There were various sex scandals and things like that. And it turned into something that was very nasty. Primary players included Bruce Pells, Ted Johnstone / Dave McDaniel, Mitch Evans, who was, if I recall correctly, one of the people who worked to destroy it. So were the Trimbles. And the Trimbles then got completely involved in the SCA in ways which were exactly the things they were worried about happening with Coventry. It was started by Stansbury, Rich Stansbury, I think. Someone will correct me.
Paul
and
Stanbury.
Paul
Paul.
Stansbury, yeah, right, yes. And it's one of those things which I couldn't get full stories out of anybody at the time, and I really wanted to, because Bruce really infused in me a desire to learn more about fan history. And over again, fandom has dealt with problems that society has later gone on to try to deal with, like, you know, role playing, like the whole Breendoggle, and that fandom did it badly first. And then everyone else comes along and does it exactly the same, only much bigger and still badly.
I've often thought that was a very interesting research topic, and maybe somebody will get a dissertation out of it someday, would be the extent to which various aspects of today's modern computer communications life was influenced by people from fandom who were involved in the very early stages of computer stuff.
Good. Yeah, that is an interesting thought. Back in the 80s, maybe the 90s, somebody was publishing a directory of apps called Full Moon. And does anybody have a list of full of apps, anything like that these days? Because I have no sense of how many of them there are left. Everybody talks about apps dying on the vine, but we've got what, 40 plus people here, and lots of apps are getting mentioned, that some of which I've never heard of. And I'm just curious if anybody's doing that.
I wonder also to what extent the APA concept has spread beyond fandom. I remember, for example, when I lived in Montpelier, Vermont, about 40 years ago, sitting in a laundromat one day, waiting for my laundry, looking through Mini APA, which I remember at the time. I got the mailing. And a friend of mine saw it and asked me what it was, and I explained it. And she thought, oh, that was a really neat concept. And she would think about starting something like that among her friends. So I'm just wondering to what extent, again, I guess another example of fandom having an influence outside of itself. I wonder how much of our APA experience has been replicated outside of fandom by other communities.
Well, certainly the rise of the zine phenomenon in the 80s and beyond came out of fandom, just as rock music criticism came out of Crawdaddy, which was Paul Williams' fanzine, and then got turned into an actual magazine. Yes. Fandom has been the source of a lot of stuff, just as fandom has been the sink of a lot of stuff. A true fan history would be impossible to do, and I'm really impressed with what FANAC has been doing with the Fancyclopedia, you know, in effect, the Fan Wikipedia. There's a lot of information there, and there's more than can ever actually be written, because there are so many different perspectives on exactly what things are like. You know, and I've got a folder here which is Alva Rogers' correspondence about the Breendoggle with everybody, because we dealt with Alva's stuff and I didn't want to see that all get thrown out. But it's not something, it shows that at the time of the Breendoggle, things were a lot more heated in print than they were in individual letters, that people were much more willing to compromise. And we see this all over the internet now. People are not willing to compromise in public, where they actually have a fairly nuanced view in private.
Mhm.
I was just going to say, in response to Amy's question about this of APAs, somebody, and I wish I could remember who, was definitely collecting a list of APAs fairly recently. Maybe someone in the chat will remember. So I think I gave them some information on TWP at the time, but I don't know where that list is. But I do wonder how many of you, I mean, there's a lot of talk about different APAs, but I'm not sure how many of them are still alive and viable now. I think certainly it went through a phase in around the time that people started getting into live journals and bulletin boards and so forth, where people really started to abandon doing APAs because they did want that faster rate of communication. But I think I noticed it around 2018 when I was guest at the EasterCon, that there were people there who wanted to do things that were not on the internet. They was getting to a point where people were a bit worried about their electronic footprint and wanted to go back to something that was a bit more containable. So either print APAs or fairly well privately managed electronic APAs. So I think there has been a little bit of a revival in interest. But from my perspective, I don't know if that's true, something you've seen in America.
So we have 40 plus people on this Zoom now. Okay, everybody, roll call. Please put in the chat the APAs you are currently a member of, active APAs that are out there today. And if you would, make a little note on whether they're paper or electronic or any other thing that you think would be good to get into Fancyclopedia. And while they're doing that, the participants on the panel, talk a little bit more about how you feel about the difference between online communication and APAs, and you know, what the difference is that you value and that helps you stay in APAs. Why are you still in APAs? What's the difference?
Oh, the intimacy. They're small. They're, as someone said, controllable in that you don't have to worry about everybody on the planet looking in on what you're doing. You know, that's what it is for me. I just like having a small group, and it's thoughtful. Because it's slower, you have time to think about what people say.
Yeah, I think that's what Amy's saying there is quite key to me, because there was the point where everybody was diving into sort of live journal and live blogging their lives. I just felt I needed a bit more time for reflection, and also that things move so fast online that I didn't have that time to think about what I wanted to say on a subject. Whereas in an APA, you do have that time because it's a bit slower. And the other thing I like about APAs is deadlines. I know this is probably unfashionable, but having a deadline really helps me to actually get around, put time aside to write the thing I want to write and respond to the stuff in the APA. If I'm responding to a fanzine, I'm probably going to miss the deadline because I don't know what it is.
Right.
I agree quite with what you've said, Christina. Now, my only APA these days is the FAPA, and I belong to that more as a matter of helping to keep an ancient fannish institution off life support or on life support. But the other thing I really appreciate about the FAPA is that there are the deadlines. My goal is to produce my zine every quarter. Since my format includes starting off with a brief essay and then have letters and my comments on those letters, it forces me to figure out, okay, what am I going to write? How am I going to write it? How am I going to keep it to the appropriate length? And so on. So it's a very good discipline.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm not in any APAs at this point. So the closest thing to an APA, there's the doorbell, that I'm involved with is an online discussion group that's, again, more like an intentional community, which was put together by Howard Rheingold and has a couple of people who I know through fandom who've been parts of it. But, that's called Brainstorms, and it was founded for civil adult conversation. And the bar to get into it is you have to write them a letter saying what you'd contribute to the conversation. But that's a pretty low bar if you think about it.
I've only been in one APA, and I only lasted a couple of years because I always missed the deadline. But I had to put in I had to write something for them before they would decide whether or not to admit me. Is that typical?
No, I
Not
don't
in
think
my
so.
experience.
Theoretically, the FAPA still requires credentials. That is a couple of things you've written or produced in order to qualify as a member. Though, given the fact that there are 15 or 16 members in 65 places, I suspect that anybody who showed an interest would probably be welcomed.
Certainly true in TWP that providing you're a woman or presenting as a woman, then you don't have to prove that you can write or do art to be in it, because part of the criteria for MINAC in TWP is either 2 sides of writing or 1 page of art. So, but no, we've never auditioned anybody.
Do you have a problem? You said a woman or presenting as a woman. Have you ever had a problem with people pretending to be women?
No, we've not had that. We've had a problem over in the early days over a member who was known to be to some people as trans, and so there was quite a big debate and some fairly rather nasty stuff went on because of this.
Yeah.
So I feel that now TWP is very much is not going to inquire into the biological origin of a member, so long as there's someone that lives as a woman.
Yeah. There was a lot of flap about that in AWA as well, centering around a trans woman. This was back in the 70s and 80s, I think. It was actually before I joined, so I missed it. Thank God. You know,
I wasn't thinking so much of transgender people as rather people who pretended to be a woman so that they could, as it were, listen in on what they would consider to be an interesting, intimate discussion.
golly, it's a lot of work to do one of these. Why would you?
If they did, we don't know, because we never found out, unless it's an open secret that I didn't know about. We did have a bit of controversy over D West doing a cover for TWP. I think possibly under an assumed name, but I think it was everybody knew it was D West, and some people were annoyed because normally the covers are done by one of the members, and that's kind of part of a tradition of the APA.